We are live on a Monday. On a Monday, it is April 11th. Where has the year gone? Where has the year gone? Um, man, it's crazy. It feels like we just turned over the quarter and already we're flying through parts of the quarter. Anyhow, I'm distracted because I'm looking over here at what LinkedIn is doing with the live feed, and I can't tell exactly what it's doing. So, anyhow, we'll see how this thing works out. The theme this week is around simplifying things. Simplifying things. How can you simplify things? Well, the way I like to look at it, and actually, let's use an Albert Einstein quote to kick things off. Genius is making complex ideas simple, not making simple ideas complex. Now, there are a number of you who are probably looking at this diagram, this diagram back over here, and you're saying, wow, that looks pretty complex. Well, if you're not involved in revenue, if you haven't led revenue teams, if you haven't started building out your territory, yeah, that kind of stuff is complex. And, you know, I mean, there's a reason I don't work on cars. I know how to turn them on. I know how to turn them on, but I don't go in there and start tearing apart the engine. Other than there was a time a while back where I replaced the valve cover gasket on an engine. And when I did it, I didn't know what a torque wrench was. So don't take vehicle advice from me. Genius is making complex ideas simple, not making simple ideas complex. So, what does this diagram show? Well, if in the middle part, this is the money you need to make inside your territory, and you back up a step before that, you start to say, what is it that drives that money? If I'm an individual contributor, I'm building out my territory. There are going to be a handful of ways that I can create pipeline. Okay. There are a handful of ways I can create pipeline. I can create pipeline within my existing customer base. I can create pipeline by bringing on new customers. Okay. I can bring on new customers. I can create pipeline within my existing customer base. Then you start to work back a little bit further and say, okay, well, relative to my existing customer base, here's what outreach might look like. Relative to a new customer base, here's what outreach might look like. Here might be some tactics that I can execute on to help draw more attention to me. Anyhow, some of the stuff looks complex when you draw it up on a board, but if you get into the detail, you actually realize there's a simple way to look at each of the challenges we have in front of us. So let's talk about how do you create complexity. One of the ways that you create complexity is by adding things to the equation. Think about it when you were in school and you were working on math. If you're talking about 1 + 1 = 2, that's pretty simple. But what happens when you actually add in a variable like a fraction? So now you have your numerator and your denominator. How does that start to change the equation? It adds complexity. Well, what happens if we start removing those items? Well, this is what you get into, and I think it's algebra. When you first start removing, you start solving for components. You remove a couple of the variables, you get to the point where the solution becomes more clear. Things start to get simple. So if we want to add complexity, let's add parts. If we want to simplify things, let's remove parts. Now, there's a time and a place where you hit this threshold where things need to be as complex as necessary, as simple as possible. And that's a dance. It's a dance that you're going to go through inside each of your organizations. So it's a dance that you go through when you hire people. It's a dance that you go through when you're leading people. There are going to be these different opportunities where you can add more variables, create complexity, reduce variables, and start to simplify. The point of this week, though, is about finding ways to simplify what you're doing, reduce the amount of things that you're doing so that your ability to execute increases. Reduce so that your ability to execute increases. So, going back to the Einstein quote, genius is making complex ideas simple, not making simple ideas complex. And I'll leave you with one more piece on this. Think about when you made your first paper airplane. First paper airplane. How many folds did you put into that paper airplane in order to get it to fly? How many folds did you put in the airplane in order to get it to fly? Then you might have added an additional fold in order to get it to fly straight, or maybe something else in order to get it to loop, maybe something else in order to get it to increase elevation. But it started with a simple shape, a simple couple of folds. Then as you graduated, you may have decided that now I want to get involved in remote control airplanes. Heck, before remote control airplanes, maybe you had one of those balsa wood airplanes that had a propeller on it, and you'd spin the propeller around and it would provide propulsion, I guess. This is where I'm getting outside of my depth, but it would provide this momentum so that you could get more airflow into the airplane and get better lift, and it would lift for a longer period of time. Well, that airplane had more parts to it. It had a propeller, it had a rubber band, it probably had a couple of wings, and it had a vertical stabilizer and a horizontal stabilizer in the tail. Well, then you move on and you start adding things like an engine. And then you get into bigger airplanes, and those bigger airplanes can move people. But fundamentally, that paper airplane did the same thing. It traveled from one place to another over a period of time. One place to another, traveled space over a period of time. So if you're out there building your revenue engine inside your organization and you have many parts and you don't really understand how they fit together, you may be adding complexity into your business that is not necessary. Identify ways that you can simplify and go out there and execute. Have a great day. I hope you have an awesome week. And thanks for jumping in on here.